Hi, everybody. Today's lecture is going to be focusing on the female reproductive system. So let's go ahead and get started. Looking at the main reproductive organ for females or gonads would be ovaries, where you will be producing the main sex cells or gametes referred to as oocytes. The shape of these structures or ovaries are almond shaped. They are located in the pelvic area and they are flanking the uterus on either side. So they are paired. They are attached to the uterus or the body of the uterus using what we identified as ligaments. We will talk about these ligaments in future slides. The gametes or oocytes that are being released during the process of ovulation in a female are eventually going to be fertilized if there is any sperm present in the female reproductive system. The oocytes also are growing inside a structure referred to as ovarian follicle, which are present within the ovary. And again, we'll take a look at these structures in just a few minutes. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is how we are keeping the female reproductive system in position in terms of the positioning of the ligaments. So there are a total of 4 ligaments present within the female reproductive system. They are known as broad ligament, round ligament, suspensory ligament, and ovarian ligament. Some of the names are self-explanatory. For instance, the ovarian ligaments are the lateral surface of the uterus and medial surface of the ovary. So if you take a look at the picture, the ligament that extends from the medial aspect of the ovary into the lateral aspect of the uterus, these are referred to as the ovarian ligament. The second set of ligaments you have are the ones that are suspending the reproductive organs within the pelvic cavity. And because they're suspending, they're also called suspensory ligament. The next one we have are broad ligaments. These are attached to the wall and floor of the pelvic cavity. They are continue to form the parietal layer of the peritoneum. Again, remember, peritoneum is the serous membrane that is present within the abdominal pelvic cavity. So what you see right here as this sheath-like structure, that's the broad ligament. And running inside the broad ligament, perpendicular to the broad ligament, is what we have identified as round ligament. And what you see is this structure right here, which is your round ligament. So again, the goal of these ligaments is to keep the reproductive organs in place and stabilizes the structures. Now, since the main organ we're talking about in terms of reproductive organs in females is the ovaries, we will start by talking very briefly about ovarian cycle. Ovarian cycle is the changes that happens to an egg during the process of 1 month or 1 cycle. And these 3 phases of ovarian cycle are identified as follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. Now, each of these have, follicular phase and luteal phase, each have their own phases or smaller segmentations within them. So let's go ahead and talk about those. So when we talk about follicular phase, it typically happens within the first 14 days of the ovarian cycle. They are basically where you will start with an ova or an egg surrounded with layers of epithelium, and that structure is referred to as a follicle. Now, follicle that is developed during the first 14 days, basically, or first 14 days of your menstrual cycle, is what eventually releases a mature egg during the process of ovulation. So, what is the original follicle that we start with? These are called primordial follicle. Again, these are immature follicles. To give you an idea, Every baby girl that is born with about 4 million primordial follicles in their ovaries. And these primordial follicles starts to degrade the first few years of life. So by the time a girl reaches the maturity as and starting to receive start her menstrual cycle, um, most of these primordial follicles, about 90% of them have been degraded. So you are typically left with about 400,000 primordial follicle. Now, primary follicle, one at a given time from each ovary, from one ovary every month, undergoes changes and it starts to grow. This becomes the primordial follicle, where you have a single layer of follicular or granulosa cells around your oocyte. So what it looks like on a picture is, sorry guys, back. So you have your primary follicles, again, relatively small. At the center of this, you have your oocyte, and the single layer around that would be your single follicular layer, which forms the granulosa cells. Now, as time passes by, again, this structure starts to grow. So you have more than one layer surrounding your cell. Your oocyte is growing, and eventually it will become a larger structure. So again, here is your primary. You start to grow this. The structure becomes more pronounced. So it becomes your secondary follicle. And by the time around 13 or 14th days of the menstrual cycle, that creates what we call a mature or Graafian follicle. So mature and Graafian follicle has a few structures. First of all, it has a structure called antrum, which is basically filled with fluid. So this is structure you see right here, that's the antrum. Right within that, you have the oocyte. So here is the oocyte that is definitely larger from the first oocyte that you started with. The other structure that is very clear in the in the mature follicle is the ovum is supported with multiple layers of follicular cells immediately around that. So here is your follicular cells, and immediately around your oocyte. So this layer right here is referred to as the corona radiata. So corona radiata surrounds the ovum, and then ovum is supported with other layers of follicular cells around it. So looking at this picture again, we started with primordial follicle, which I do not have presented here in this picture, but primordial follicle somewhere here, these ones right here, which leads to the primary follicle. Primary follicles leads to your secondary follicles, which are these. Secondary follicle leads to development of Graafian or mature follicle. What do you need to know about the mature follicle is that you have your oocyte, which is surrounded by cells called corona radiata, which is surrounded by follicular cells of Frege. And you also have the cavity filled with fluid referred to as the antrum. Now, the second phase of the ovarian cycle after follicular phase is ovulation. So simply put, ovulation is release of the oocyte fitting from the ovary into the pelvic cavity. And when an oocyte gets released, it also carries its cells that are right around the oocyte called the corona radiata. So going back to the picture, here is your oocyte, here is the corona radiata around that. And this picture is depicting ovulation, where the oocyte and the corona radiata have been released into the pelvic cavity from the ovary. Now, one thing before we move on is that you notice not the whole structure is released. not the whole Graafian follicles being released during the ovulation. The follicular cells that are right here remains behind after ovulation. So why is this important? We'll talk about the last phase, which is called the luteal phase, in just a minute. Now, when we release an oocyte during the ovulation process, that oocyte literally gets released into the pelvic cavity. So how do I get that oocyte into the next organ within the female reproductive system, which is known as the uterine tube or the fallopian tube? So for that, we rely on these finger-like extensions that are found at the beginning of the fallopian tube, called fimbriae. So, sorry, let me find my picture. So right here is your ovary. These finger-like extensions are your fimbriae, and that is your fallopian or uterine tube. So when the ovaries release the oocyte during the ovulation, which is this little circle you see right here, these fimbriae, these finger-like extensions, create a wave motion. And with this wave motion, they grab the oocyte and bring it into the uterine tube. So it is important for that transfer to take place. Now, as we mentioned earlier, when the ovulation takes place, the follicular cells of the Graafian follicle remains behind. And that is going to be the start of the third phase of the ovarian cycle, which is referred to as the luteal phase. Now, luteal phase starts with producing a new structure called the corpus luteum. So if you go back to the picture right here, here is your follicular cells, which just starts to form what we depict right here as these large yellow structure called the corpus luteum. What is the purpose of the corpus luteum? It allows for the continuous secretion of the two, the main sex hormones essential for the implantation of the possible fertilized egg within the uterine wall if there is a pregnancy. So they do produce sex hormones at this stage. And what if there is no pregnancy? What if within the right after ovulation, the fertilized egg is non-existent? In that scenario, your corpus luteum starts to degrade. So it will not continue to produce the hormones to support a possible pregnancy because the chance is already gone by. So corpus luteum starts to degrade and form a structure called corpus albicans, which basically no longer secrete and release any hormones. So right here you have the very pronounced corpus luteum, which if not used effectively in the absence of pregnancy, it becomes a degraded stage called the corpus albicans. So if I ask you guys, just reviewing what we discussed so far, if I ask you name the three phases of the ovarian cycle, you start with follicular phase, followed by ovulation, followed by luteal phase. What are the phases of the follicular phase? We have the primordial phase, followed by primary follicle, secondary follicle, Graafian follicle. That leads to the second phase of ovarian cycle, which is ovulation, where the oocyte gets released into the pelvic cavity and picked up by the fimbriae and transferred into the fallopian tube. And during that time, the follicular cells, which are the remaining structures of the follicle or the Graafian follicle, convert into corpus luteum, where they continue to produce the hormones necessary for pregnancy. And if there is no pregnancy, corpus luteum degrades leading to creation of what we identified as corpus albicans. So here's again, same concept we described, and again, during the ovarian cycle. Now, the next structure within our path is uterine or fallopian tube. The importance of uterine or fallopian tube is that it is the location for fertilization of an egg. If a sperm is present, so basically if a sperm wants to reach and fertilize an egg, it needs to go through majority of the reproductive organs of a female. It does have segmentation identified as infundibulum, ampulla, and isthmus. So let's take a look at the pictures. So the part that is closest to the fimbres are called infundibulum. The curvature of the fallopian tube is called the ampulla, and the ending part where it gets connected to the uterus is called isthmus. What is again the importance of ampulla? Ampulla, or that curvature within the fallopian tube, is where the sperm can fertilize an egg during the possible pregnancy. And fimbres, we already talked about them. Those are the finger-like extensions that ensure that the oocyte can get picked up and transferred into the fallopian tube during the process of ovulation. Now, the next structure within the path is the uterus. Uterus is a muscular hollow organ, which is the site of implanting the embryo and development of the fetus if there is a pregnancy. And in the absence of the pregnancy, it's the site for menstrual cycle. Now, what is uterus actually made up of? Uterus is made up of 3 layers. The inner layer or innermost lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. And endo, again, remember, means inside. This is the mucosal lining of the uterus. It's highly vascularized, and it is the lining that is shed during menstrual cycle. So it basically is created and removed every menstrual cycle because of the possible chance of pregnancy. The thickest layer of the uterus is myometrium. If you recall, the word myo means muscle. So this is basically a smooth muscle that is sensitive to a hormone called oxytocin, released by the posterior pituitary gland. This is the hormone better known as the love hormone, quote unquote. This is important because you will see an elevation of the oxytocin during childbirth, which causes severe contractions of the uterus and allows the baby to be pushed out of the birth canal. It is also important in terms of creating bonds between mother and child or other individuals, hence the name love hormone. And it's also involved in the process of lactation. The outermost layer of the uterus is referred to as adventitia, which is also known as the perimetrium. Now, what are the components and breakdown of the uterus? The top of the uterus, the dome shape, which is similar to the stomach, is referred to as the fundus. The midsection of the uterus is referred to as the body. And then the narrowing at the end of the female reproductive system is referred to as the cervix, which has 2 narrowing, what we identify as the external and what we identify as internal os. So right here, the narrowing closest to the uterus is inside, so it's referred to as the internal os, and the one closest to the vagina, that's the external os. So this narrowing as a whole would be identified as the cervix. So following cervix, which is the opening of the uterus, We have the vagina. Vagina is also identified as the muscular tube. The importance of vagina is involved both in childbirth and intercourse, allowing the sperm to be introduced into the female reproductive system. Location-wise, it is posterior to the urethra and anterior to the rectum. So if you take a look at the positioning of the female reproductive organs and the urinary system, first of all, there is no overlap between the two, like what we described in case of male. So what you have here is you have the ovaries. These are your finger-like extensions, which are your femores, right? Here's your fallopian tube, which connects to the uterus. Narrowing of the uterus is the cervix, and then cervix opens up to the vagina. So this is the opening of the vagina, which is posterior to the urethra. Here's the urethra, and anterior to the rectum. So if you compare the orifices in male versus female, females have 3 openings, one for the urinary, one for reproductive, one for the digestive system, versus in male, you only have 2 openings, one that is both for urinary and reproductive system, which is the urethra, and then one for the digestive system. So I'm kind of walking back to it. What is the histology of the vagina? A couple things. The outermost layer is a stela adventitia. It does contain a thick fibrous connective tissue that is wrapped around the organ. It does again contain muscles, so it has contained a smooth muscle on its muscularis layer. And the inner lining of the vagina contains a lot of mucosal lining, which allows basically the production of lubrication during intercourse and childbirth. It is also lined with lamina propria and a stratified squamous epithelium with the goal of protection as the vagina opens up to the outside. There is a thin vascular covering to the vagina, and that's referred to as the hymen. Hymen is not present in everybody, and it can be easily ruptured in some cases. Now, when we're talking about vagina, it also does contain ruches, so it does have folds that are visible if you take a look at the picture. So these folds that you see are the ruches. And again, it allows for the expansion of the vagina, especially during childbirth. And lastly, what we have is the external genitalia in the case of female, which are made up of 2 sets of labia, major and minor. Again, labia, remember, implies lips. So the outer lips is homologous to the scrotum in male. They contain skin, and again, homologous to the scrotum of male. The inner lips are referred to as labia minor. These are moist mucous membrane, and they contain a much higher level of vasculature. We also have the homologous structure to the glans penis, which is clitoris. It does contain, like glans penis, contains erectile tissue that can be also covered with the folds of the genitalia. And perineum is what you identify as this diamond-shaped structure. It's not actually a structure, imaginary area that is dashed off, which contains the urethral orifice as an opening of the urinary system to the outside. the external genitalia, which is basically the labia minorum, labia majora, and the clitoris, as well as the anus. So right here, you can see the peritoneum right here. Again, you have the urethra, which is the urinary or the urethral orifice. You have the larger opening associated with the vaginal orifice, and then at the end you have the rectum, sorry, anus that opens up in terms of digestive system. Mammary glands. Mammary glands are important and are involved during childbearing years. These are modified sweat glands, which always surprises me when I think about this. They do have glandular structure, which are identified as undeveloped in non-pregnant women. However, they can be stimulated to produce milk during and right after childbirth as the level of the hormone oxytocin elevates. And again, we already took a look at the lateral and anterior view of the female reproductive system. Please make sure you guys take some time and look at these two pictures. Make sure you guys feel comfortable with the layers of the layers and the structures of the uterus. You're familiar with the stages of the ovarian cycle, and familiar with both the anterior view of the female reproductive system as well as the lateral view of the reproductive system. Any of the pictures that we have shown in the PowerPoint for both male and female reproductive system can be used in your final exam. So please make sure to take your time and review them and let me know if you have any questions.